start noticing that I am higher than I have ever been my entire life. Like I'm up on the world looking down at the planets and stars just...
Is America legalizing weed? Well, not necessarily. But in case you haven't heard, the US Justice Department does have plans to ease restrictions on cannabis. We'll discuss Sativa versus Indica and THC versus CBD. We'll cover the benefits versus risks and their implications for the development of the adolescent brain versus the adult brain. We'll also cover the medical purposes that cannabis is either currently being used for or being considered for. Since the passage of the Controlled Substance Act in 1970, cannabis has been classified as a Schedule I drug in the United States. This means it has high potential for abuse and addiction, no accepted medical use, and is strictly prohibited.
Under this law, all businesses and professionals involved in this activity must register with the federal government and abide by the various regulations which are imposed to safeguard against their diversion into the illicit traffic.
Basically, it was an off-limits drug. This scheduling was part of the broader context of the War on Drugs, initiated by the US government in the 1970s. The War on Drugs encompassed a wide range of policies and initiatives aimed at reducing the production, distribution, and consumption of illegal drugs, with an emphasis on enforcement, criminalization, and punitive measures. Cannabis was one of the primary targets of this campaign, along with other substances such as heroin and cocaine. Without going too deep into the war on drugs and how racial prejudice within America has affected the social structures within it, and at times unjustly influenced the legal system, many wondered, and obviously are still wondering, whether or not cannabis ever really deserved to be deemed such a dangerous drug.
Historically, legislation regulating cannabis has a shady background.
In fact, cannabis has a long history of use for medicinal, recreational, and industrial purposes, and its therapeutic properties have been increasingly recognized by medical professionals. So, as attitudes and laws evolved since then, it became more widely accepted to varying degrees in certain jurisdictions. In other places like Canada, for example, weed is totally legal, though the specifics of cannabis laws, such as where it can be consumed and sold, can vary by province and territory. In the United States, there has yet to be a federal shift towards the acceptance of cannabis as a potential therapeutic agent since the war on drugs. Until now. The US government is considering reclassifying cannabis to a Schedule III drug, alongside codeine, ketamine, and steroids. These have lower abuse potential and accepted medicinal use. This would mean it could be properly researched, clinical studies could be conducted, and pharmaceutical companies could now get involved in its sale, in states in which it's legal. Overall, it would mean a big step for American healthcare. But is it healthy? In today's video, we're going to discuss how cannabis works on the brain and the body. However, in attempting to evaluate both the risks and the potential benefits, we must understand that since recent clinical studies are minimal, so too may be our understanding of how its health effects will interact with the current landscape of our society and the dynamics within it. For example, our modern world has seen an increase in mental health issues since the introduction of social media, more particularly how we engage with it, and cannabis, in certain cases, has been known to worsen certain mental health issues. So while there may be a history of cannabis used for medicinal purposes, the drug may not have the same effects on the people, especially the young people of today, as it did in times past. Not to say that it couldn't possibly help with, say, depression or anxiety that may be correlated to problematic internet usage and subsequently help moderate that as well, but that it could exacerbate both issues further. This is just an example to highlight the new factors we have to take into account when addressing its therapeutic potential. We must consider the broader societal context. That said, let's get into it. Before we get into the specific health benefits cannabis may have, we have to get a general understanding of how it works within the brain and the body. That is, it works on the body's cannabinoid system.
Put your whole face over that. Yes, there. Do it like you mean it.
Now, before the weed advocates get all excited.
Now, calling them cannabinoid receptors is kind of misleading. It makes it sound like they're designed to be stimulated by cannabis.
As explained by Hank Green from the science educational channel The Sci Show, as well as any other who are familiar with the physiology of the body, the cannabinoid system isn't technically meant for cannabis, bro. However, it was named after cannabis because the cannabinoids found in the cannabis plant were the first compounds discovered to interact with the certain receptors throughout the brain and body, leading to various physiological and psychoactive effects. Phytocannabinoids are the exogenous cannabinoids extracted from flowering plants from the cannabis genus, including Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis. Furthermore, scientists discovered endogenous neurotransmitters called endocannabinoids, such as 2-arachidonyl glycerol, or 2-AG, and anandamide.
Its name, anandamide, which is kind of a beautiful word, comes from the Sanskrit word for inner bliss.
As Hank explains, this endocannabinoid, for example, is responsible for forming short-term connections between nerve cells and plays a part in the brain's ability to forget things. A kind of live and let go mentality. So you can start to see the similarities between its effects and those of cannabis. These endocannabinoids belong to the same class of chemicals, aka cannabinoids, as THC, and can interact with the same receptors but are produced naturally by the body. Now, the receptors that both endogenous and exogenous cannabinoids bind to play a crucial role in regulating various physiological processes, including mood, memory, appetite, pain sensation, and inflammation. There are two types of cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2. CB1 are those that are found mainly in the brain and nervous system, where they affect how neurons communicate and regulate the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine, GABA, and glutamate.
Their highest density occurs in the areas of the brain responsible for pleasure, thinking, memory, coordination, time perception.
On the other hand, CB2 receptors are found mostly in the immune system and help regulate inflammation and immune responses. They're not as common in the brain as CB1 receptors. In short, CB1 receptors are like traffic lights for your brain, while CB2 receptors are more like security guards for your immune system. Depending on whether these receptors are activated by endocannabinoids or cannabis, their effects will vary. Now, endocannabinoids are neurotransmitters but have somewhat unique properties compared to other neurotransmitters. To give a brief recap of what a neurotransmitter is, ASAP Science explains that neurons are the cells that process information in the brain, and neurotransmitters are basically their chemical messengers.
By releasing chemicals called neurotransmitters from the axon of one neuron to the dendrite of another, they change the electrical charge of the receiving neuron.
Depending on the message, they either excite or inhibit the next neuron, with excitement propagating the signal along the neural network.
Though it sounds simple, these signals work together and the effect is quickly compounded into complex configurations within milliseconds.
However, as I said, endocannabinoids aren't just any neurotransmitters. One unique property is that they are lipid-based molecules rather than being water-soluble like most neurotransmitters. As Dr. Huberman explains, this is also a trait of cannabis itself.
THC and CBD are highly what we call lipophilic. They have an affinity toward and they can actually pass through fatty tissues.
Every cell, particularly neurons, has a layer of fat or a membrane around the outside, and these molecules, both endocannabinoids and cannabis, can easily penetrate this and therefore quickly take action within the body. With weed, because the delivery of psychoactive and biological compounds to the bloodstream is almost immediate, so is the high, bro.
In fact, within 30 seconds, it's going to enter the brain and permeate throughout the brain and body.
This is much quicker than nicotine or alcohol. He goes on to say that this high typically peaks after 30 minutes and lasts 3 to 4 hours. Not only that, but because of their lipophilic nature, both endogenous and exogenous cannabinoids can remain in the cell for a long time afterwards. They have a high affinity for fat, so once they enter cells, they can be stored within lipid droplets or bind to intracellular proteins, which can prolong their presence in the cell. This means that cannabis can be picked up on a drug test for up to 80 days. after the initial dose.
It's just a drug test, so nothing to be scared of.
I'm excited. What kind of drugs are we testing?
Another unique property of endocannabinoids as neurotransmitters that is crucial to bettering our understanding of how cannabis works on the cannabinoid system is that endocannabinoids often act as retrograde neurotransmitters. As mental health educator with TED Ed Initiative and physiatrist Anis Baji explains, the endocannabinoids travel in the opposite direction to influence the presynaptic neuron, kind of like the tenet of psychoactive drugs,
essentially giving it feedback from the receiving neuron.
Endocannabinoids and their feedback play a crucial role in modulating signaling by either amplifying it or diminishing it.
Feedback from endocannabinoids slows down rates of neural signaling.
Though this doesn't necessarily mean it slows down behavior or perception in a straightforward manner, as Dr. Baji points out. This means you still have to be actively engaged with your experience, but less clear-headed. Regardless, endocannabinoids are released in response to specific stimuli at particular locations and therefore exert their effects locally, only influencing nearby neurons. In contrast, cannabis compounds are not released in a localized manner.
But it binds to receptors all over this sprawling, diffuse system at once.
This widespread binding can indeed affect signaling dynamics in several ways. Firstly, they slow down signaling even more so. Endocannabinoids usually calm down nerve activity by stopping the release of neurotransmitter from the nerve cell before it sends a signal. This helps control how strong and how long signals last. In a sense, they downregulate neural activity in certain circumstances, such as when in pain.
It's actually very scientific. I won't go into it right now, but
when cannabis compounds attach to the same places where endocannabinoids work, they do not give feedback to the presynaptic terminal, but bind on the postsynaptic side and regulate further neurotransmission from there. They can make this calming effect even stronger, slowing down signals even more, or refusing to pass along the signal altogether.
Let's say neuron 1 needs to tell neuron 2 to do something. Well, if THC is bound to one of those neurons, that communication is more likely to fail.
It's like a game of telephone, and the cannabis molecule is like, wait, what? Another process cannabis can disrupt is precise control. While both endocannabinoids and cannabis compounds can influence signaling dynamics, the mode of action and specificity of endocannabinoids make them particularly effective in modulating neuronal activity in a controlled manner, whereas cannabis compounds may introduce a broader and potentially less predictable modulation. So that's a general overview of the cannabinoid system and the similarities and differences between how endogenous and exogenous work within it. I'd like to go a little bit deeper now on how cannabis in particular affects the brain and body. Cannabis binds to cannabinoid receptors, most of which are CB1 receptors, most of which are in the central nervous system. As Dr. Huberman explains, depending on the particular compound ingested, which is determined by factors like type, ratio, strain, and dosage.
There are going to be a constellation of different accelerations and breaking of different neural systems in the brain and body.
He goes on to say that though effects can vary drastically from individual to individual, and there will be exceptions, there are also general rules. For the most part, Sativa is a stimulant and Indica is a relaxant. I'll elaborate on each one. Let's start first with Sativa.
I guess I'll look at your sativas then. Ooh, sorry, we're actually all out of sativas. Okay.
Smoking or ingesting Sativa will result in what's considered a head high. The effects are elevated mood, alertness and focus, talkativeness, increased energy, and creative stimulation. It does this by interacting with a few important neural networks, primarily the prefrontal cortex.
If you have a certain type of sativa that'll sizzle my eyeballs, I'll smoke it.
This system is involved in executive functioning and includes processes like decision-making, impulse control, attention, and planning. It acts as somewhat of a conductor for the rest of the brain. When the CB1 receptors in the prefrontal cortex are activated, this happens.
And the prefrontal cortex acts as a strong modulator of so-called limbic circuitry and other circuitry that is more stress-oriented.
The main threat detection circuitry he's referring to would be the amygdala. It processes emotions, particularly fear and anxiety, and is almost like a fire alarm that initiates the body's physiological responses to perceived threats and triggers the appropriate fight or flight response. It evolved to help us with survival, except it can sometimes jump to conclusions and overreact, especially in our modern world in which we don't face as many life-threatening situations as our primitive ancestors.
They are circuits that are constantly evaluating one's own internal state and what's happening externally, but the default is to detect danger.
So sativa, via activation of the prefrontal cortex, helps reduce activity in the amygdala. As Dr. Huberman explains, there is a sort of seesaw effect that increases attention and decreases worry. This molecule comes into your brain and shifts everything towards a state of happy focus.
I did enjoy the one because he got me a sativa once and he told me to smoke it before I did some work, and I actually saw the benefits of it.
And there is another contributing factor to this intense state of mind. There is a natural phenomenon that occurs within the neurons known as the refractory period that allows the brain to function in a calm and controlled manner. As explained in the ASAP science video,
neurons temporarily become unresponsive after firing to prevent them from overreacting or being too dominant.
It goes on to say that cannabis removes the refractory period of neurons that are already active, causing the thoughts, imagination, and perception to utterly magnify itself. Basically, you go off on a tangent, caught up in the momentum of an idea, and the neurons just keep firing.
This means once you begin your train of thought, it becomes the most significant and profound thing ever.
Heightened sense of importance about whatever it is that we happen to be doing.
Moreover, there is anecdotal evidence and some studies suggest that sativa may also influence the activity of dopamine and norepinephrine systems in the brain, contributing to the stimulating effects associated with these strains. So those are some of the traits unique to sativa. And again, there will be some crossover in effects, but these are generalizations.
What's with the smoke?
Muffler.
And there are also effects that are shared by both sativa and indica, which I will mention soon. But before I do, let's discuss indica's defining characteristics, the body high. Known for their relaxing and sedating effects, indica strains may directly bind with CB1 receptors in regions like the amygdala, leading to a more pronounced calming effect.
Also tends to suppress activation of the amygdala and threat detection centers in the brain, again binding the same CB1 receptors in the...
It does this without ramping up focus because it also suppresses the activity of the prefrontal cortex, essentially turning off thinking and planning. Furthermore, while cannabis in general is known to affect dopamine and mood, the way indica strains do this is by enhancing GABA, which then regulates dopamine release. Indica tends to have a higher CBD content than sativa, and CBD is what enhances GABA. GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. It maintains a balance of excitation and inhibition in the brain. It is often associated with calming and relaxation effects, and dysfunction of the GABA system has been implicated in various neurological and psychiatric disorders. Now, let's get into some of the mechanisms affected by both indica and sativa strains.
It also tends to shut down the hippocampus, an area of the brain associated with memory.
Obviously, this is why people have memory issues, mainly short-term and occasionally long-term ones too.
Why did I take out my phone?
Dr. Huberman also goes on to say that there is a general suppression of the basal ganglia and cerebellum, which both affect physical mobility.
Are areas of the brain that are involved in action planning and withholding action, so that would be the basal ganglia, so-called go, no-go.
This may lead to alterations in movement, coordination, and motor performance. This is why they say, don't take drugs and drive, bro. Or operate heavy machinery.
And the cerebellum, which is involved in balance, but also motor planning and motor sequencing.
This may result in symptoms such as clumsiness, unsteadiness, and impaired coordination, which can increase the risks of falls and accidents. As Fergie would say, you got me tripping, stumbling.
2, 3.
Another common effect of cannabis is the munchies.
What have I done?
Oh, what have I done? Dr. Huberman continues by explaining that this is mediated, at least in part, by the large amount of CB1 receptors in the hypothalamus that, when activated, stimulate appetite. This is done through two mechanisms.
One is a cognitive mechanism of creating a preoccupation with food and anticipation of taste.
There is a locking in on that craving, which tends to be junk food.
And narrowing of focus so that you're not thinking about anything else, but also signaling from the hypothalamus to the gut to neurons within the stomach itself that regulate blood sugars.
So yeah, that's a generalization of how cannabis affects the brain. Though it's important to note that the precise mechanisms and interactions within the brain are still an area of ongoing research. Additionally, individual responses to cannabis can vary based on factors such as genetics, tolerance, and overall health. Furthermore, many people praise cannabis for its ability to relieve anxiety, but many people have a completely different experience.
Depending on dosage, but also pre-existing neural circuitry and propensity for anxiety, people will experience anxiety and paranoia.
Marijuana can also cause hallucinations or paranoid delusions, known as marijuana-induced psychosis.
These usually subside when the high wears off, but can also have long-lasting effects. This is a more common side effect of sativa-dominant or THC-dominant compounds, which is why the industry puts such an emphasis on hybridization and tailoring cannabis strains to minimize side effects and personalize it to an individual and their specific situation.
But still, many people are ingesting cannabis, THC, CBD through sources where they don't really know how much they're bringing into their system.
However, though mitigating negative responses may be getting better with the commercialization of it, it's still very difficult to anticipate how any individual, especially new users, may react to cannabis regardless of the strain.
Chronic cannabis use, so more than twice per week, has consistently been associated with mental health disorders.
He goes on to say that a chronic user is 4 times more likely of psychosis later on in life for those with predisposition to psychotic disorders like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, both of which have a strong genetic component.
This is when paranoia starts to set in. If you're with other people, avoid eye contact. You will get your soul stolen.
People are 30% more likely to develop one of these disorders for themselves if they have a first-degree relative who had it. And the risk is only magnified with exposure to triggering substances like cannabis. For the most part, there are 2 general rules.
The more potent, the higher probability of developing psychosis or a major depressive episode or a major anxiety disorder later in life.
THC turns up the volume on everything you're already feeling.
The risk for damaging your mental health from cannabis use is higher the younger you are. The brain is still developing until at least age 25, making it much more vulnerable and more susceptible to external interference.
And that a huge number of systems related to mood regulation, so-called executive function, the ability to organize one's thoughts, plan, and execute plans.
As he explains, a young person's ability to learn to direct their own life, to be a functional human being, and develop a healthy, strong, resilient brain relies on fine-tuning of the very same neural circuitry that we already mentioned is affected by cannabis usage. Psychiatrist Dr. Baji explains that
in people younger than 25, cannabinoid receptors are more concentrated in the white matter.
The white matter is involved in communication, learning, emotion, and memory.
Frequent marijuana use can disrupt the development of white matter tracts and affect the brain's ability to grow new connections.
Therefore, it's essential that the adolescent brain is allowed to grow as undisturbed as it can, and cannabis will affect it much differently than it would an adult. This is problematic because
greatest number of people that are starting to use cannabis are in the age bracket of 16 to 24.
He goes on to say that this is because there is a perception that it's healthy, and young people are likely to use it without realizing the health consequences that can await them later on. Smoking can obviously affect lung health and damage blood vessels. According to Health Canada, in general, it can increase heart rate, which can increase the risk of heart attack. Other research echoes the possibility for adverse cardiovascular effects. A study presented by the American College of Cardiology, or the ACC, showed those who used marijuana daily were found to be about 1/3 more likely to develop coronary artery disease compared with people who had never used the drug. Cannabis can also decrease blood pressure, leading to fainting or syncope. The decreased blood pressure may result from the vasodilatory effects of certain cannabinoids, such as CBD, which can relax blood vessels and reduce peripheral resistance. However, other sources say it can do the opposite. That is, increase blood pressure, especially in heavy users. In a PBS video, registered nurse Sheena Williams points out that
your blood pressure rises. This might mean the blood vessels become inflamed or a buildup of plaque in the artery.
the conflicting claims underscore the complexity of its physiological effects and the need for further research. Cannabis can also make you nauseous, especially if you consume a lot. Though it may not have as many immediate adverse health effects as other drugs, any dependence on a substance can be dangerous and can impact all areas of a person's life. Williams brings up an important point. According to the CDC, 3 out of 10 users have cannabis use disorder,
which is defined as a person that is unable to stop using marijuana even though it's causing health and social problems in their lives.
She also notes that the 2021 U.S. National Survey on Drug Use and Health found that 16 million had a cannabis use disorder, most of whom were aged 18 to 25. And primary care physician and Harvard instructor Dr. Peter Grinspoon highlights something important.
70 to 80% of them are untreated anxiety and depression disorders.
Not only can people become dependent, which can mask other disorders and underlying issues, but tolerance can easily build.
The brain and body become less sensitive to marijuana after repeated uses. It takes more to achieve the same effects.
However, as the video points out, there is no real risk of fatal overdose, and heavy use does not lead to debilitating or life-threatening withdrawal. A person may experience sleep disturbances, irritability, and depressed mood, but it will usually subside within a few weeks of stopping. All of this is to say, it doesn't seem that cannabis is going away. Rather, it is being embraced more, so now it becomes a matter of using it cautiously and responsibly. People praise the medical potential it holds and claim that it is either equally as effective or even more effective as some prescription medications with less side effects.
We have to really define what safely means, and we have to really acknowledge a pretty loose set of controls over what one is bringing into their brain and body.
It's difficult to regulate your consumption of it, especially in places it's unregulated. And as he points out, even under very controlled conditions, it's hard to predict how it'll affect you. That said, it's the same theme we discussed in the vaping video, when we were looking at the possibility of vaping as a smoking cessation device. That is, just because something is healthier than, say, other drugs, doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy. But does cannabis get a bad rap? As journalist Lee Adams says on a Vice video,
the messages that those videos are trying to get across, that cannabis will ruin your life, that's all bullshit.
He, like many others, believes that the pros far outweigh the cons, and the narrative that weed makes you stupid is unfounded.
Several studies have found that weed smokers are often thinner, fitter, and generally more active.
He seems to suggest that weed may keep you active. While this may be a stretch, it may not actually be the cause of laziness. He also points out this.
Their data cannot definitively attest to whether there is a causal relationship between low IQs and prolonged cannabis use.
This is somewhat confirmed in a 2016 longitudinal twin study on the impact of adolescent marijuana use on intelligence. It basically says that users do tend to have lower test scores, but again, it may not be because of cannabis. Another claim that Adams refutes is that weed is a gateway drug, pointing out that alcohol and tobacco are typically used before exposure to cannabis. His final rebuttal to the cannabis ban debate is against the point that legalization may cause mass cannabis use, to which he responds.
First of all, if it did, so what? We're all high already, dog.
And though I don't think that because everyone's already doing it is a legitimate justification, I do want to look at cannabis from an objective lens, at least in terms of its therapeutic potential. Let's discuss what medical cannabis is currently licensed to treat and what it's being considered for. Of the US states that allow for access to cannabis, chronic pain, cancer, glaucoma, HIV, seizures, epilepsy, and multiple sclerosis are the most recognized qualifying conditions.
I got back problems, I'm bipolar, Medical marijuana means being able to function physically and mentally.
According to the medical text, medicinal cannabis for the treatment of chronic pain. Medical marijuana can be traced back approximately 5,000 years to Chinese physicians using it to treat pain associated with childbirth, rheumatic pain, malaria, and even constipation. So the use of it for healing is nothing new.
More than 25% of US adults suffering from chronic pain use cannabis to alleviate the symptoms of their condition.
It affects approximately 1 in 5 Americans with an estimated cost of $560 billion with a B, for medical care and disability. There is strong evidence for cannabis effectively treating chronic pain in adults. Not only that, many believe cannabis could replace the use of conventional pain medications, for example, opiates.
This is probably 2 years worth of empty pharmaceutical boxes. I believe I've earned the right to introduce cannabis medicine into my own regime. I've done this.
With one study noting a 64% reduction in opioid use in patients with chronic pain who patronized a medical cannabis dispensary in Michigan.
Now here goes the pain. Goodbye.
Dr. Huberman points out that there are cannabinoid receptors throughout the body, including on the spinal cord, which, when bound to, may help alleviate pain by interfering with pain signaling pathways. However, while there does seem to be some analgesic or pain-relieving properties, this is quite often the case.
A lot of people believe that they experience more pain relief than they actually do. It actually has a lot to do with a perceptual shift to basically focusing on other things.
As a doctor, I know firsthand that a lot of physical pain is mental, which is something that needs to be considered in the treatment of many cases of chronic pain. That said, I'm not discounting the possible health benefits cannabis could have. Let's look into a few more, shall we? Aside from chronic pain, there's substantial evidence ranging from modest to moderate effect for the benefit of cannabis or cannabinoids for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting and patient-reported symptoms of spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. In these studies, the primary route of administration was oral.
Here you go, 1 pound of marijuana, and you can sign for it right here.
I signed for this and it's mine. Take it.
So those are the well-studied health benefits, which does not necessarily mean the therapeutic potential of cannabis is limited to just those, but rather highlights the need for further research. There are other ailments that people swear cannabis helps with, though the evidence so far is limited. The idea is if it can help with chronic pain, it must be able to help pain in general.
My leg's on fire.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Didn't see that?
It's literally on fire.
In a Harvard Health article, Dr. Grinspan writes, it may successfully treat fibromyalgia, endometriosis, interstitial cystitis, pain and wasting syndrome associated with HIV, as well as irritable bowel syndrome and Crohn's disease. Because it is a muscle relaxant, it may also lessen tremors in Parkinson's disease.
And the best way to take it is put it under your tongue and rub it in your cheek. Don't do too much, you're going to be asleep all afternoon. Just relax. See what happens.
Boosting certain branches of the endocannabinoid system is helpful in relieving symptoms of Parkinson's.
There has been some evidence that it helps with secondary sleep conditions, meaning where sleep disturbances are secondary to the underlying condition, such as with MS or chronic pain, but not necessarily with chronic insomnia. However, people do report subjective benefit from it, leading many to switch from their sleep medications to cannabis to help them get through the night.
I genuinely believe it is a safer and less toxic alternative to many of the current pharmaceutical sleeping medications.
At least a quarter of those participants reported negative symptoms similar to that of hangovers.
Overall, both THC and CBD demonstrate anti-inflammatory, analgesic, and antispasmodic properties, which can help with a lot of medical issues. But some people are hesitant to ingest THC. They don't want the high associated with cannabis. Which brings me to my next point, CBD.
Cannabidiol, or CBD, is THC's non-hallucinogenic buddy, the yin to the yang.
Cannabidiol, or CBD, seems like a sensible step towards medical cannabis, both for a government considering legalization and for an individual considering using it. It won't have you tripping out, and you'll still be able to go about your day.
I think I'd rather do this than drink.
Cough the rest of your life?
Well, at least I know I can drive.
It has a similar yet distinct chemical makeup to THC and therefore works differently than other cannabis compounds. As explained by Fernando Testi in their article on marijuana's effect on brain health, unlike THC, CBD doesn't activate CB1 and CB2 receptors. Rather, it interacts with various receptors and channels, including serotonin receptors and glycine receptors, and affects other proteins involved in inflammation and pain regulation. This different mechanism of action contributes to the therapeutic potential of CBD for a wide range of conditions, including pain management, inflammation, anxiety, and neurodegenerative disorders, among others.
We're so high right now. We're not low.
It may also help conditions like Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which are severe and treatment-resistant epileptic disorders, primarily affecting children. As the science educational channel Seeker explains.
To put it simply, a seizure happens when the brain's electricity spikes and the brain circuitry freezes.
Because of its ability to calm the nervous system and modulate neuronal excitability, it can help with this.
Calm down.
I'm calm!
Speaking of calming down, in their 2015 article on CBD as a potential treatment for anxiety disorders, Esther Blessing and her team state that preclinical studies, aka on animals, show evidence that CBD reduces anxiety associated with various disorders like PTSD and generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and social anxiety disorder, and seems to work without causing anxiety itself. And while it may help with stress, one randomized control study had somewhat conflicting results, showing that though CBD lowered blood pressure and decreased stroke volume, it increased heart rate, especially before and after stress. This highlights that we are yet to understand its impact on cardiovascular function, particularly in stressful conditions. As Dr. Grinspoon points out, no drug is without side effects.
As a primary care doctor, I never think which drug is perfectly safe. I always think which is the least dangerous option.
That said, like any other medication, we have to conduct thorough research and continue to refine our understanding. Also, there's still a lot we don't know about the different forms of cannabis and therefore their potential benefits.
Bans on using cannabis in studies for decades existed and created barriers to our understanding today. How can we understand it if we can't study it?
There are still concerns about laws and social attitudes. Governments, policymakers, healthcare providers, and researchers need to overcome these hurdles before medical cannabis can be widely used, especially in place of other pharmaceuticals. In conclusion, as a doctor, I've seen and personally prescribed many synthetic drugs that, if used irresponsibly, could be very dangerous and frankly make this herb seem like just that, a plant. If it can help people with their pain and give the same relief as would harsher medications with less side effects, then great. However, it must be used responsibly. And if it is used, because it can affect individuals so differently, we have to be extremely careful of dosage. As Dr. Sanjay Gupta describes, there is a therapeutic window for any drug.
So too little is not going to do anything, and too much can have, more detrimental sort of side effects from it.
And too much can mean in terms of quantity or potency.
Hey there, champ. A friend told me you got a little too high.
We also have to understand that just because it's natural, it's not a free pass to be high all the freaking time, bro. It's still a drug and can impact your neural development and function.
Have you been smoking weed all day again? I can't believe my son is such a loser. That attitude and this behavior won't get you anywhere in this world.
Ultimately, being truly natural and healthy means not having to rely on any drug to live well.
What is the cannabis helping the person with in the first place, and then help them find a more appropriate and healthy way to address it?
It's as Dr. Grinspoon says, we can't just take the drug. We also need to consider what it is that we may need to adjust in our life. Do we need more social connection, exercise, better quality sleep, more nutrition, a constructive and possibly creative outlet? We can't be passive about our health, no matter how healthy the medical treatment may seem. Again, we want to live healthily instead of constantly needing healing.
Now listen!
That's called motherfucking bars. It's like puff, puff, pass, and not puff, 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 puff.
Is that why no puff puff? Pass the dutchie, my friends. This is nothing. I cut myself shaving.
If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe and give it a big thumbs up to feed the algorithm. And if you are already subscribed, make sure that you weren't unsubscribed from the channel by the Illuminati. Our next goal is 700,000 subs, and we would love to have you with the squad when we get there. If you didn't like the video, be sure to let me know why in the comment section down below. I read as many comments as I can, and we use your feedback to make our videos better for you. For longer form content of an interactive nature, consider checking out my podcast channel where I interview interesting personalities in the health and movement space. And don't forget to follow my gym, Human 2.0 Fitness, for free right here on YouTube, where we post content that helps you move better and prevent injury. Or check out Human at Home, where we teach you how to live healthily in your home, bro, in your home. Because not everyone can access a gym like mine. And if you simply want to support the channel and our creative team, then consider becoming a member, bro. Otherwise, as always, that's been a word from Dr. Chris, not your everyday ortho, where we see one, do one, teach one.